Hello and welcome back to this video. And I'm going to confess something. I'm keeping track of everything, not on you in particular, but I'm keeping track on the data that I'm seeing about all the videos that I have posted. And I'm paying attention in particular to like two different things. Obviously, what topics are more interested in within the interest, when is exactly when people start leaving. And one of the things that come across more clearly is that after the minute 20-ish, some of you are not paying attention, obviously, because the focus or the retention can actually be shortened because we all have too many things to do to be paying attention to longer videos. So what I'm going to try to do from now on is to get the same subjects, and I'm going to divide them into chunks so it's easier for everyone to digest it. It's also easier for us to have a discussion, and hopefully that way I can come across, or some of the points can come across much easier. And at least, again, you have the time to digest information. So this is going to be one part of the series that I'm going to be doing. And the main subject that I want to cover is focus. And I know that when we talk about biases, normally we don't think about focus as being important part of the biases, but it does have a lot to do with biases, or at least the formation of the biases, because a lot of our biases are produced because of not only necessarily our lack of focus, which sometimes it is a cause of some of our biases, but in what we focus, which is again the cause of other type of biases. So since that is so important, I decided to create a series, and today is going to be focused availability and bias. And I'm going to make sure that I explain what that thing about availability, what that availability means in the context of bias. Now, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to start with a real weird question. What if what you're seeing right now, what if what you're perceiving, my face, everything that you're seeing, hearing, all the noises, even the things that you're perceiving at home or whatever it is that you're watching right now, you can be watching this from the office. What if none of that is real? What if this is part of a dream? Like, how do you know that statement is not true? How do you know? How are you sure that that statement of this is not real, this is part of a dream? How do you know that that is not true? Is there anything in particular that you can point out that tells you, oh, this is real because of A? Before you even try to give an answer to that, just keep in mind that although it is a simple question, people have struggled with the same question for millennia. In fact, philosophers have been trying to respond to the same or answer to the same question now for thousands and thousands of years. Now, obviously, they have different answers, but that idea comes from the idea of the concept that we have of consciousness. Like, what is the now? Are we even aware of what we are doing right now? Are we conscious of where we are, and if so, like, what is conscious exactly? How can I tell that when I'm experiencing right now, it exists? Now, this concept of consciousness is a very difficult one for us to understand. And what does it exactly mean to be aware? Have you thought about this in particular? Have you thought about that idea of what is conscious, or what is it to mean? What does it mean to be aware of something? A lot of that has to do with our focus. Knowing that we are here, for example, requires us to focus on the present and to focus on the things that are in front of us to determine if we're here or not. So again, one of the things that can respond to that question is that I know that we are present because I can point at several things. I can touch something. I can make sure that I touch, for example, this computer, that I can type and there's a response. So that could be an answer, but even then, even if you touch, how is that any different than the experience that you would have at a dream? Now, what does this have to be or have to do again to focus, or what does it mean to focus on something in particular? Well, I could give you an idea of focusing, but instead I'm going to tell you from a neuroscience point of view, what does it mean to be mindful of things, or to be conscious of things, or to focus on things. Now, when we talk about focusing from a neuroscience, again, from a neuroscience point of view, it's not necessarily only a matter of what you're paying attention to. Yeah, that has to do with part of it. but it's as much to that as it is as much as what is it that I'm not paying attention to, meaning what is it that I'm disregarding. Right now, I don't know if you can hear, but there's like an uncomfortable sound from construction that is somewhere in this office. Could be upstairs on the other side, but you probably cannot be aware of that. But I'm aware of that. Now, sometimes when I'm talking right now, for example, to camera, I'm actually disregarding those sounds. So while I'm focusing on you, when I'm focusing on there, while I'm focusing on the computer to see the slides and see what I have to tell, at the moment that I'm doing that, I'm actually selecting what I'm going to focus on, but at the same time, I'm disregarding what I don't want to focus on. Now, focusing on something, even if it feels natural and effortless, and sometimes it does, for example, when you have an engaging conversation with someone, you might not be even aware of your surroundings. You might not even aware of like a car approaching or someone passing by and whatever. So when you're so engaged in something, you might actually disregard a lot of that information, quote unquote, effortlessly, meaning you're not even aware that you're making an effort, but it actually requires some effort. Again, it depends on the strength of the thing that you're focusing on, like in the passion in which you are focusing on. Again, if there's something that is pressing, like a moment that is so interesting, so intense that captures your attention, that engages some of your brain into focusing on one thing, and it will require a little bit less effort because part of your brain is brain wired literally to focus on that and disregard the other ones. But in general, when we're talking about, for example, let's imagine that you're reading or you're trying to study, and then all of a sudden you start to hear like that sound uncomfortable. That again, I don't know if you can hear or not. But you probably have experienced that idea of being reading some, or trying to read something, or trying to study, and then something else happening, and you kind of like having to make an effort to keep focused because that is so distracting to you. Why? Because that noise that you're listening to, or that someone doing something else in front of you, captures your attention. So your brain is also brain wired to interpret those things. Is that sound telling you something? Is that sound important to you? Especially when we're hearing noises. Noise is related to something that can be potentially dangerous to you. So that's why, for example, we have a harder time to disregard those sounds that are intense because, again, your brain needs to pay attention to them because it's actually something that could be potentially important for you. So now, focusing on something, even if it feels natural or effortless, actually requires some effort. The effort of canceling all the information you don't want to pay attention to. That is a key component of focusing. Again, is the effort of canceling that idea or those things that are coming to your brain, those inputs that you're receiving that you don't want to pay attention to. Now, to an extreme, the extreme of, by the way, this is kind of like, and I'm going to say a technical word, but I want you to associate that with what we're discussing right now. But keep in mind that that can be also used to describe a disorder. Sometimes that is called a sensory discrimination. That means that among all the senses, you're focusing on particular inputs and you're disregarding and other ones, right? Now, when we take that to an extreme, and again, this can be very dangerous in the case of sensory discrimination disorder. People affected with this condition receive the information all jumbled up. Basically, they have a lot of inputs and they don't even know where the input comes from. And that is completely terrible because it can affect any area that you can imagine that has sensitivity. In this case, could affect your visual. It could be affecting your tactile sensations. It could affect even the discriminatory efforts for you to elaborate a muscle movement, for example. And they're, again, incapable of determining where this information is coming from or even organizing a proper output. So just to give you an idea on how that can affect people, imagine that you eat an onion and an apple and you cannot tell a difference between one and the other one. That could be a way for you to determine that you have this disorder. And or if you're going, for example, to throw a baseball ball, and then you can imagine that you're feeling you're going to throw super hard. You even feel that you're throwing super hard, and then you realize that the ball just fell a couple of inches from you. So that actually happens to people with these conditions. Again, why? Because in this case, this is an extreme. Like the person cannot distinguish, they cannot discriminate between one and the other one. So again, this is an extreme, but we all do pretty much the same thing when we normally, not to that degree, obviously, but we actually distinguish between what is useful and what is not every single day in every task that you do, especially when you have to do something that requires your attention, even just writing an email, reading, even watching the news. That means that you're canceling out other inputs that are happening at the same time. Now, so focus again is as much a matter of discrimination as it is of paying attention to something in particular. Now, when we talk about biases, and I know you probably are wondering, wait, what does it have to do with biases? The first instinct that we have is to think that we choose to be biased, right? Like, especially when we talk about other people being biased, the first instinct that we always have is that, well, that person is biased because that person is doing A, B, and C. It's choosing to listening to the type of news that they're listening, or they're reading the type of newspaper. So it's that person is biased because he's actually doing something to become biased. That is somehow our responsibility. That somehow is our responsibility to know that we're biased and that we have to do something about being biased, right? So that's the first knee-jerk reaction that we have, especially when talking about other people being biased. So, well, we're biased, or that person is biased because the person chose or chooses, because constantly choosing to read the newspaper again, reading the news, or watching the TV that is watching, and then somehow there's those people are responsible for their own biases. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of that. It's true that most people are kind of responsible for what they choose, but obviously there's some things that we are aware of. But I would say, and hopefully by now, because this is something that I have insisted throughout these years over and over again, and hopefully this is clear by now, is that most of our biases do not need awareness. That doesn't mean that we're not aware of. You can be plenty aware of your biases, and still, most of the time, they happen without your conscious mind. That means that you don't require your conscious brain for you to, be biased. You actually are most of the time biased when you're not aware. Now, I'm going to ask you another question, and I would like you to actually take some time to think about it. And this is something that has been asked in the past, and I'm going to give you two case scenarios. The first case scenario is, what do you think? Well, I'm going to ask you, what is that you think that is most likely to happen? And I'm going to give you two case scenarios. One is that there is a flooding in the U.S., in the United States, anywhere, that kills 1,000 people. Or possibility number two, that there is an earthquake that creates a flooding. There's an earthquake in California that creates a flooding that kills 1,000 people. So I want you to take your time to think about it. Now, believe it or not, this question was actually asked and was part of an important research conducted by Professors Versky and Kahneman. And you have heard me talking about Kahneman, hopefully now, a couple of times. He is regarded as the father of biases because he was the one talking about biases, and the creator of that concept of system 1 and system 2. So believe it or not, these professors asked this question, and a lot of people answered that the second possibility was actually the most likely to happen. I'm going to repeat. They believe that it's most likely that the earthquake in California created the flooding, killing 1,000 people. Now, if I give you the time, obviously you're going to reach the right, quote unquote, right conclusion, is that the probability of flooding without any specific cost is actually always going to be more likely than when I give you a cost, when I give you a specific cost of that flooding. So it's the same as if I ask you, for example, what is more probable, than a person is wearing any t-shirt or a person is wearing a green t-shirt. Obviously, there's more probability that a person wears a t-shirt than a person wears a green t-shirt, because a green t-shirt is a subset of t-shirt. Now, why then did a lot of people choose the second option? Why is it that a lot of people chose to believe that there's more probability for the California earthquake to cause the flooding rather than just a flooding for any cause? And that is because of the concept that I'm going to talk about, and that is the availability heuristics. Now, as we have explained in the series, our brain tends to make snap judgments based on our experiences and the experiences of others. This is what we sometimes refer as heuristics. Those are our heuristics. Believe it or not, in most cases, our responses are not based in sound judgments, but rather in quick responses that have little to do with reasons or reasoning. That doesn't mean that we're necessarily unreasonable, that you can actually be right even about that. It's just that you're not required to have a reasonable judgment to create a quick response. In this case, again, the conscious mind is not necessary, it's not needed for you to create that response. When we are asked a question, we tend to gather information to compare with our past experiences or experiences of others. And hopefully those experiences or experiences of others can help us understand the question that is being asked, the problem that we have to solve, and we will be able to give, again, an answer. The problem is that sometimes because of stress, society's pressure, or even feeling embarrassed about something that you want to say, and then you are scared that you want to look horrible, or even being part of a research, which is that example that I just gave you, we tend to give a quick answer. Okay, no, just like an answer, but a quicker answer, just because you feel, again, that level of pressure. In this case, our brain searches for things in the past that are similar to this problem that I'm trying to solve or questions that I'm trying to answer. And that happens every single time you encounter a problem. And by problem, I mean every time someone asks you a question and you have to solve that, meaning you have to answer the question. Or it could be something that happens to you, something that you have to fix, for example, and you are comparing with things in the past to elaborate a proper response. Now, in this case, as I said before, our brain searches for things in the past to create an answer and compares with the things that you have experienced in the past that might be very similar or equal to what you are seeing right now. The prefrontal cortex, as the organizers of the brain, remember from that lesson that we discussed the anatomy of the brain. In this case, that would be, if this will be as your fist, the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex will be right here. It's a part that is before the cortex. Frontal, in this case, is on the front, is the organizer of the brain. And in this case, is in charge of both coordinating the search, meaning looking for those responses, and at the same time is also in charge of processing the answer. So again, it's not only in charge of giving the answer itself, it's also in charge of organizing that information or looking and searching for that information throughout all the brain. Now, just sufficient is for me to say that obviously it's not going to be the only one intervening in that. In fact, as I always say, our cortex is not only active in isolation, and sometimes things happen that trigger other portions of the brain, and especially we have to be aware of our emotional side. We always have discussed in the past about the influence of the amygdala, for example, and remember that the amygdala is, in this case, activated when something stressful happens, something that you're afraid of. So that activation of the amygdala might actually trigger you going in one direction or the other one. So again, we don't only have the influence of our conscious brain, in this case, the cortex that represents that conscious, or the process that makes us being aware of things, but also of our emotional side, our emotional brain, if you will. I was going to say something else, but I don't want to complicate things. So during a normal search, as I said before, the prefrontal cortex uses every form of information available that is similar. So again, it starts comparing with things that in the past that occurred. Maybe you start imagining someone else dealing with the same problem as you did, trying to fix the same thing that you did, and you're trying to think about what is exactly what that person did. You're starting to visualize what that person did. You're starting hearing the voice of that person explaining the process. You might even get a sense of what happened, depending on how sensible you are to these inputs. And again, this is the key word, as I said before, not an exact situation. You're always looking for similar situations because, again, there's no exact situation that is going to be replicated. It's not going to be the exact same thing happening twice to you. There's always variabilities that make a situation similar to other one, but not the exact same situation. So when confronted with a problem, you're going to give an approximate answer. Again, this is an approximate answer, as I said before, since similar situations but not equal. Your answer cannot be perfect because it's going to be similar to, but it's not going to be the exact answer. Maybe it's a proper answer, but again, it's going to be an approximate answer according to what you know and not necessarily the answer you need to give. And I'm going to stop that because this can be, I need to unpack that for a second. So again, you're having access to all the information that you have in the past to compare with the present moment and see if that information that you have in the past that helped someone else to solve the problem that you have right now can help you. But since those situations were not the same, again, they cannot be two exact same situations. It could be similar situations. And I know you probably are going to say, well, semantics. That situation is the exact same situation. It was not, because every situation is unique and has its unique conditions. That doesn't mean that sometimes similar situation cannot have the same answer. Now, every time you have that concept of having similar situations, you elaborate an answer based on what you interpret happened at that moment. So there are two things now to take into account. Let me give you a precise example. Let's say that you're biking and then your wheel went to the side, hit the rock, or whatever happened, but now you have you have to, I don't know, like a problem with your wheel that was the exact same thing that happened to your brother years ago. And now you're starting to compare that information that is happening to you. You see that the wheel turned into the same side. You recognize that it's the exact same problem. And now you're starting visualizing that with what your brother did. And then you're starting to hear that. There are two things. One, it might not be the exact same thing. It might be that, well, there's a similarity between the wheel problem that your brother had with his bike and your problem might be slightly different. But also, there's a second issue on, are you remembering exactly what happened, or you're missing some information? And chances are, as we have discussed in the past about the information loss over time, you're going to come up right now with a mix of the information that you remember at that moment because you interpreted that way when you heard it, and that information that you don't have access to, that now you probably are going to cover by adding some extra information. And again, it's not that you're trying to lie to yourself by adding extra information, it's because that actually happens to every brain. Meaning, when there's a gap, sometimes we tend to cover that gap with certain information. And if you're remembering something that is crucial, you can see how that can be problematic. Now, when confronted again with a problem, you're going to give an approximate answer according to what you know and not necessarily the answer that you need to give. Again, the reason is what I just explained to you, because maybe you had faulty information from the beginning, and then obviously you cannot remember everything, and you're covering that information with some information that was not clear at that time. But wait, what does this have to do with the probability of a flooding happening? You probably are asking yourself, what does this have to do with the problem that you were asking me a couple of minutes ago? Well, in that case, I mean, the case of the people who chose the second answer, the answer in which, again, they saw that there's a higher probability for a flooding happening in California after an earthquake. The people who answered that the probability of a flood after an earthquake in California is higher has to do with our attention to two words. One is earthquake, and two is California, and the way in which we took that for an answer. Now, our brain tried to, in that case, to process that information of the flooding but instead went immediately to what was immediately available or accessible to the brain, which is again that relationship between earthquake and California. Since again, that information is not only still available, it has been repeated so many times because think about how many times have you heard of a flooding in general? Maybe not that many times, but you probably have heard many, not here in the United States. I mean, probably has to do more with certain areas. But if you're not of that area, you probably are more aware of California and earthquakes because it have been happening. It has been happening for centuries now. So again, that information is still available to you because of the amount of times you have seen California and earthquakes related or being related in the news. Now, the interesting thing is to know what other times that has happened to you. How many times have you thought that you were responding to someone or to give someone an answer about something, you're actually not given an answer to that question? Or worse, how many times were you convinced of an idea or an answer and it turned out to be the wrong answer? So when we talk about availability again, we talk about, and that is pretty clear, what is available to your brain at that moment. So if you're confronting a problem, if you are trying to respond something, some question, or you're trying to give an answer to, again, a problem that you might have, your brain is starting to compare. And instead of giving the proper answer, the brain is going to interpret the proper answer based on what is easily available to it, to your brain. So that means that if you don't have enough examples of that problem, you might give a different answer, but your brain is not going to distinguish. Your brain is going to believe that that is the proper answer. Worst, and this is when availability heuristics can actually become a little bit more tricky. Depending on your personal experience, you can actually magnify more things, certain things than other. What do I mean by that? With the exact same example. If I gave you the same question, but it happens that you have yourself experienced flooding at home and you don't live in California, the reverse would happen. The reverse, that means that it's not necessarily based on the data that you're gathering, that you're so knowledgeable of flooding, but if you suffer the consequences of a flooding, meaning you lost your house, or that has happened literally to you twice, chances are that you're going to magnify that. And the trick question is, if I tell you what is the chances for you to experience a flooding in general, chances are that you're going to give a much, much higher probability than what is actually normal or actually true. And you might end up saying, well, 1 in 1,000 rather than 1 in a million, which is closer to the reality. Now, the reason why we do that is because, again, that information is available to us, not because of the frequency in which that happened. It's because of the gravity of the situation to you, in this case, to me. If I've experienced, again, a bad situation, if that has happened to me, I'm not going to think about probability because that actually happened to me, and I'm going to magnify that. So again, all of these, and I give you just two examples, one in which the repetition of an idea can create an idea or can make an idea to be easily available to your brain. And then when confronted with a problem in which that idea is related to, I'm going to actually relate that idea to that problem. I'm going to give that as an answer. That is one, but there's also, as I said before, a relationship between the intensity of an event and your calculation in probability. So that is called availability heuristics. Again, the heuristics that we experience once something is when we confront a problem, and our capacity to look for an answer based on what is easily available to your brain. As you can see, none of this has to do with reality. None of this has to do with real data or even with truth. It has to do with, again, repetition in one case, and then how intense was the event in the second case. So hopefully this was clear. As I said before, this is going to be a shorter one. Next, I will be talking about focalism or anchoring, or how we tend to give an answer depending on the prior associations we make to a particular subject, which is kind of related to what I was just discussing on the second part. So hopefully you like this video. Again, hopefully this is going to be a little bit interesting. Thank you so much for watching it. and I see you in the next video.